This is Retrohammer, Space Marine Dreadnought Evolution, 1987 to 2017. An enduring theme of warfare in science fiction has been the concept of the walking tank, humanoid war machines equipped with powerful weaponry, armour, and most strikingly of all the ability to stride across a battlefield, borne upon legs. The idea of a single pilot or crew commanding such vehicles dates from classic works such as The War of the Worlds, through to the 1980s with the anime popularisation in Gundam and Macross, and into modern times in films such as Pacific Rim or video games like Titanfall. The War Walker is a powerful trope with a long-lasting reach. The nascent Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader did not neglect these War Walkers in its background, but the game designers were limited by the available production capability of the time and the chosen scale of 28mm. The solution to this challenge was ingenious and simple: relatively small suits that both fit the skirmish scale of the game well and stayed within the bounds of what Games Workshop could manufacture at the time. The name given to these was simple and effective: Dreadnoughts. As well as its imposing sound, this name was well chosen in literal terms, for the pilot of one of these suits would fear little indeed. All major races of the Rogue Trader game received their own Dreadnought designs, including the three classics of the forces of the Imperium, the Contemptor, Deradio, and Furibundus classes, known affectionately as Chuck, Eddie, and Fury. Within a few months of Warhammer 40,000 being released, all three modular models, sculpted by Bob Naismith, were released, and greatly expanded rules were made available in the Centennial edition of White Dwarf, later consolidated to the venerable Warhammer 40,000 Compendium. It is important to note that these units were available to all Imperial forces and were not limited to the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes. Thus, the Imperial Army, later Guard, also fielded these walking tanks in their formations. Another point worthy of note was a different way in which the pilot-dreadnought relationship began to develop, compared to many other science fiction depictions. It was soon determined that in Imperial suits, the pilot was surgically implanted, with the control systems being grafted directly onto their nervous system via spinal column implants. In this state, the pilot saw through the sensors of his or her suit, and their body was held curled in a fetal position in a capsule protected by amniotic fluid. While offering improved responsiveness of control, the pilot could not simply get out after the battle, and was in effect a prisoner of a war machine until it was destroyed or they ejected. A grisly reality fitting the grim nature of the 41st millennium Imperium of Man. With the advent of 2nd edition in 1993, Imperial Dreadnoughts changed significantly in both form and nature. The new design created by Jez Goodwin was an Astartes-only machine, and the concept took on a new significance as the pilot was no longer a fully fit individual, but a Marine who had been terribly and grievously wounded in battle and was on the brink of death. As an Astartes, they could survive their maiming, even if their body was shattered. So the Dreadnought now became a living tomb of a great fallen warrior, their skills and experience preserved to serve the chapter, sometimes across many millennia. The appearance of a Dreadnought was completely changed, a much larger, bulkier design, centered on the sarcophagus bearing the Marine warrior, emphasizing the nature of the machine. This distinctive model attained a certain notoriety as originally produced in pewter, and even when the alloy was changed to the lighter lead-free variety, it remained excessively heavy, a characteristic addressed in the coming years. This design, eventually to be known as the Castroferrum pattern, was made in many different variants, firstly in metal and then later in a series of plastic kits which both increase the armament options while eliminating the weight problems of the metal kits. Further variety came from Forge World's Mark IV and Mark V versions as time moved on, but no further new designs were introduced. After a gap of almost 20 years, an explosion of new designs appeared, starting in 2011 with the Contempt Dreadnought sculpted by Will Hayes of Forge World. Moving into the medium of resin, this new design offered posability far beyond anything that had preceded it, and the design paid homage to the early days of 40k and drew heavily from the epic-scaled plastic Dreadnought made for the Space Marine game. Next came a wide variety of Legion-specific variants for the newly released Horus Heresy game, which in turn were followed by the Deradio and then the Leviathan. Finally, a trio of new designs were released for the Legio Custodes in the shape of the Contempt Galatus, Achilles, and Telemon Heavy Dreadnoughts. After the explosion of designs from Forge World, Games Workshop played the final act in the Dreadnought story so far in 2017. The colossal Primaries Redemptor Dreadnought, designed by Jez Goodwin and sculpted by Tom Walton, was released almost 30 years after the original Rogue Trader designs by Bob Naismith. The original concept of a walking tank combining heavy firepower, armour and close combat capability remained as potent as ever. And thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Retrohammer, where I'm going to take you through the evolution of Space Marine Dreadnought designs over the last 30 years. And of course, we're going to start at the very beginning with the original models designed for the Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader game back in 1987. And we have two examples of these in front of us here. We'll be taking a detailed look and exploring these miniatures, and then we'll be going on a journey looking at all the Space Marine Dreadnoughts, or certainly the significant steps along the evolution of where we've got to today, with an absolute abundance of designs we can now see in the game. I'm also going to show you some of the early artwork and the original rules for these Dreadnoughts as featured in Warhammer 40,000 and then White Dwarf 100, that article eventually becoming part of the well-known Warhammer Compendium. So without further ado, let's take a look at these. Now, I've not fully assembled them, and that's for a good reason, because I want to show how the modular design of these models worked. So the original Imperial Dreadnoughts were sculpted by Bob Naismith, who did a lot of the early miniatures for Rogue Trader, and I think he did all the robots and Dreadnoughts, certainly the Imperial ones. And the original Dreadnought models weren't just released as a single kit. There are a whole series of components that could be put together in different ways to create a different style of Dreadnought. In terms of the gameplay, the weapons were to denote what the Dreadnought was armed with, but in terms of the actual body and the legs used, well, it didn't really matter. It didn't have any bearing on the game. Let's just move that guy to one side, and let's start off by looking at this. Now, these are lead pewter models, so your original white metal, and they're quite weighty. They weigh just over 100 grams each, so they've got a good feel in the hand. I've mounted these on 60mm round bases, so modern bases, because I'm going to use these as actual Dreadnoughts in 40k. But originally they were supplied with a square 40mm base, so they had a quite different look. I think even today they actually fit this size base quite nicely. So let's take a look around this model. So the first thing that strikes you about the model is it looks nothing like the Dreadnoughts that came after it. This is very distinct and unique to the time. And the Dreadnought had a somewhat, well, I don't know how you would describe the face. It's not exactly human. You might say it's humanoid. So I'm not entirely sure what the inspiration was for the look of the face, but certainly it is quite a confrontational and disturbing look to the Dreadnought with these large eyes and this mouth. And it's quite funny depending on, if you look at it from the front, it almost looks like it's smiling at you, whereas from the side it looks like it's grimacing. Quite interesting. So let's take a look around them. Now, I've spent several hours, well, more than several hours working on these two models to completely clean them up to show what the original designer's sculpt would have looked like, or as close as I can get. These were notoriously poorly cast at the time, and they typically had a great big dirty mould seam running right around the centre, so I've taken that off so we can appreciate the model for how I believe they would have looked originally when sculpted. The torso was a single piece, and there were a pair of shoulder blocks that were mounted onto that, and then onto those shoulder blocks you can mount a variety of arms. Here we've got a close combat hand with a pair of bolt guns, and on this side, for those of you who are unsure of what this weapon is supposed to be, this was actually the las cannon. This is blue tacked in place at the moment, and you'll see why soon. The legs were designed like so. These are nicely detailed. Even now, having rebuilt this model, this is still a finely detailed miniature, even today. And then on the back of the Dreadnought, there was an exhaust stack, or a power pack and exhaust stack. When we look at White Dwarf 100, they were actually kind of described what these were, and this particular one was described as being a combustion exhaust unit. But there was another design as well, so that was a nice touch. I like that. On the arm, it had these, I always thought this looked a little bit like, I don't know, some sort of bird in some way, this design here. And then on the forearm, there are a pair of bolt guns mounted on this particular example. and I've drilled these bolt gun barrels out. They weren't supplied like that. So construction was pretty straightforward. I mean, you had 2 legs, a body, 2 shoulder blocks, and 2 weapons. Pretty easy to build. They weren't exactly hugely posable. I mean, you can see the legs are all one piece, the body's one piece, so really most of the motion you would get out of the shoulders and the arms. But you could actually get some fairly decent positioning out of that. And it's fascinating looking at this to think how weapon design has changed so much. This las cannon design, there isn't really anything like it in 40k today. The las cannon design is very, very different. And this particular dreadnought is configured in the weapon options of what was called the Furibundus class dreadnought, or the Fury. And the Fury was a very heavily armed and armoured dreadnought with a pair of bolt guns and a las cannon, almost like a tank killer. And as I remember playing, it was extremely effective at that role. It really was. Very, very good at it. Perhaps a bit too good. So there we have the Furibundus. Now let's take a look at this little chap here. Now this has got the other set of body components. As you can see here, it's got this unit mounted on its head, and I think this was I just forget, some sort of motive unit, which we'll check when we look in the White Dwarf. And you'll also notice that the shoulders are narrower on this one. So this one's got these extended actuator rings. You will notice these cute little stubby legs. You've got Imperial Dreadnoughts in the long and the short-legged variety. And this is a short-legged variety. Essentially the same face design though. I'm not sure which was done first, if this was done first or that was done first. Certainly in the Rogue Trader game, there were pictures of this body before that one appeared, so I'm not sure if that was a later edition. Here we've got another close combat arm. This time it has a single bolt gun, and you could get these with both twin and single bolt guns. And the reason it's got a single bolt gun is this is outfitted as a Duradio Dreadnought, also known as Eddie. And on the other arm, we had this weapon, which again, by modern standards, looks quite unusual, but this was actually the missile launcher. And there was a bit of a tie-in with the look of this weapon and the early Space Marine weapons. And the RTB-01 box set missile launcher has a very a reminiscent sort of design at the front end to this, with the aperture that the missile would launch from. It was quite nicely detailed, and you could see how this like cylindrical magazine of missiles. This is the alternate power unit, and this was described as being a crystal battery, so a different design to the combustion unit, the internal combustion engine unit there. And you see it's got one less exhaust, so this looks like a bit more of a sophisticated power unit perhaps. There's some slight differences in the design. Now, you'll see why I've not stuck this down yet. I just want to show you something on the underside. So this is the underside detailing here. And we can also see on the inside of the feet, we've got these sort of smooth discs, the ankles, which are the same, or look the same on this version as the exterior one. One of the really unusual and odd things about this model is there was a big relief R and L on the right and left feet on the inside on the ankle. I have no idea why they were produced that way. Perhaps when they designed this, they were worried that people would stick the legs on back to front. I never had that problem, and I always thought it was quite obvious which way they went, and particularly with all the pictures and artwork that was available at the time. But nonetheless, they must have thought it was an issue, and they put them on. So they did look a little bit silly, and as you can see, I've removed them and made it look nice and clean. And I did that on this one as well. These were such iconic models. I can still remember the first ones that I bought. I actually bought two in 1988. One was a Duradio Dreadnought and one was a Contempt Dreadnought. I remember now, yeah. They both had this body. They were both long-legged. One had a pair of arms with bolters, and the Duradio was armed like this. I later on bought a third one, which had the blocky body like this, short legs, a las cannon and a twin bolter armour. That was my Furibundus. I then bought one a few years later to be part of my World Eaters force, playing in the Slaves to Darkness era. They weren't perfect though. It's very easy to get washed away by nostalgia when you look at these models, but they did have their issues. I mean, firstly, the bodies weren't very true, and you can see how when I'm holding that level, this is kind of like bent at the bottom, or it's on this slope and this grill plate's out of line. I'm not sure why that was. Doesn't really feel like it should be like that. It feels like it should be true and square. And the same was true of this Dreadnought, though perhaps it looks a little bit less noticeable on that, but it's still there. Other issues with this model were, as you can see, there's a lot of shiny surfaces on this model, which I've put there from the cleanup, and this took quite a few evenings to do the cleanup on this, and that's because they had these dirty great big mold lines running around them right across the detail. Not all the detail was very well created in the mold. As well as cleaning these up, I've also rescribed some of the details, like the edges of this plate here, and re-drilled these little screw holes or bolt holes. And some of the arms, the casting on them was pretty shocking, and they had bits missing like this one. But you know, that said, with a bit of love and time, they could be turned into really, really good looking models. And I mean, I sold my original ones for various reasons, and I've repurchased these since. I'm absolutely delighted to have these again in my collection. They still look great today, and they've got such an iconic place in 40k history. And now let's just do what I wanted to show you in terms of weapon modularity. So and take that away, and if we swap that over, then essentially we have what was almost the Contempt Dreadnought, which was a pair of close combat weapons. It was also equipped with a jump pack, which was great fun, so that they could leap around. It was brilliant. Not quite right, you should have a pair of bolt guns on each side, but you know, this would have been close enough, and that would have been what the original Contempt Dreadnought looked like. In terms of published variants, there wasn't anything like this which had a last cannon and a missile launch, although the build point system that came along in White Dwarf 100 would allow you to configure a Dreadnought if you so wished that way. But in general, Imperial Dreadnoughts had one heavy weapon and a close combat weapon with bolters, or two close combat weapons or claws and bolters. So there you have the original two Space Marine Dreadnought designs. Very, very distinctive. They were quite unlike any power suits that have come before, and we've not had anything quite like them since, so they still remain a unique look to this day. And you know, if you like the model, you can still get hold of them on eBay, although they're not mega cheap. They're probably comparable to a plastic Dreadnought. You know, you look about 25-30 quid, maybe cheaper if you're lucky. You know, if you don't mind the poor casting and you're prepared to put the time in, they can look great. And also, you know, what a great thing to have as a part of a collection if you do like the early models. So that was the actual miniatures. What we'll now do is we'll have a quick look at Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader and where these models appeared, and the White Dwarf 100 article, which really developed the rules and expanded them into how most people use them in those early days of 40k. So here we have a copy of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, the original edition. And what we're going to do is look at a little bit of artwork, just to get a feel for what Dreadnoughts were like at the time. And this is the inside jacket illustration, and it's a pretty gritty, grisly scene depicting some Space Marines. In this instance, these are Blood Angels fighting against a group of orcs, or as they would have been called then, Space Orcs. And in the middle of the picture, centre stage, is this enormous war machine. This is a Blood Angels Dreadnought. And if we just zoom in a little bit, we can see it. And this is a Naismith design. And the artist has done a great job of capturing it, but also turning it into something, well, a little bit more than just the Dreadnought as it was. It's not just like a sci-fi war machine, it's also been covered in trophies of war, some of which are quite grisly. It's flying a banner, and it also has a load of equipment and extra gear camo netted onto it, held down by this netting on top. And this is, in particular, this one is the Contempt Dreadnought, so we can see it has two sets of bolters on its power fists. Anyone who had this book and opened it, the first thing they saw centre stage was a picture of this Dreadnought. From the word go, this Dreadnought kind of like got imprinted into people's minds. And model-wise, when this book was published, they had the Contempt Dreadnought ready, and there we can see a Blood Angels version. It's got the toothy grin. I used to enjoy painting those onto mine. and all sorts of insignia as well, and the typical kill words as well. And there it says die, which was common in the Rogue Trader era. And in terms of the original rules, that was covered in this page here, and here we've got a line drawing again of the Imperial Dreadnought design. And in the description here, it was very clear that the Dreadnought was a general system that was available to troops, and it wasn't exclusive to the Space Marines. There were a couple of sketches for weapons. There's a twin bolter arm. Clearly they were working on the last cannon arm, because that's there. Just go close to that. The last cannon of a Furibundus Dreadnought. And that was the original profile, so all of its key stats were 6, apart from its attacks were 3, and then its personal characteristics were as per the pilot, and its saving throw was 3+. It'd be interesting to compare this to a modern Dreadnought's profile, and perhaps, now we're into 8th edition, not that much has moved in terms of what the Dreadnought is like, quite amusingly, really. Some things like, obviously, these have changed, but those are different, but the other stats, yeah, not a million miles away at all. Quite interesting after all this time, and the same saving throw. So we had the Dreadnoughts in Rogue Trader, and they were kind of like the first of the larger models to really make an appearance. Now, let's move forward a few months and look at White Dwarf 100, when the Dreadnoughts really explored in a lot more detail. So here we have my good old copy of White Dwarf 100. This is the original series, and this is the centenary issue. And this was published in April 1988, goodness me. Now, when this would come out, already the Imperial Dreadnoughts had been released, but here we had an advert for the Eldar Dreadnoughts, which is a story for another day. What interests us here is Rick Priestley's article called Chapter Approved, and there's another word that's making an appearance in 8th edition. Rick Priestley gets soaked in amniotic fluid when he investigates a Dreadnought. So yes, they don't write it like that anymore. This was such a classic article, this. And what it had was a mixture of background and what we might call lore, combined with a rules system to greatly expand what you could do with your Dreadnoughts, building on what was presented in the Rogue Trader book. I'm guessing in this picture here there must have been some alliance between the Marines and the Eldar. What this did is it gave you a set of rules that allowed you to create Dreadnoughts from the ground up. You could choose the pilot control, the engine type, how big it was going to be overall, and the weapons and all of its gear. And yeah, it's really an interesting flexible system. You could choose all of its profile as well. There's a whole host of rules, very cool picture there. Clearly someone must have been thinking a bit about Marine Civil War, because here we've got a Dreadnought shooting at a load of Marines here. Not sure what was going on there. Of course this was before Slaves to Darkness was published. There's an Orc Dreadnought who's seen better days. Now here's the bit I was particularly interested in from a point of view Imperial Dreadnoughts. And here we've got this neat diagram, or exploded diagram, showing all the different bits of the Imperial Dreadnoughts. And as you can see, these are all the bits that I talked about when I showed you through the miniatures. So we've got the main body here, we've got the bolt-on drive unit, which was on one of them. We've got the shoulder blocks here, these the rotary actuators, which made the taller of the two Dreadnoughts wider. We've got the shoulder block, where the arm mounts. We've got the legs, and this is shown as being a multi-terrain locomotion unit combined with an upper leg piece, a leg extension. Tucked away here, you can see the pilot wrapped away there. You've got this head movement box, which is another modular element, and then all the different weapons that would go with it. So adapted bolter, foe blaster, missile launcher called Spit Fury, and then the last cannon called Death Foe. And then finally we had the two power packs as well, the combustion fuel manifold exhaust, and then the crystal fuel manifold exhaust as well. Yeah, really cool. That diagram just brought the whole miniatures to life really well, and the slightly simpler view showing you what the Chuck version was like with two arms with bolters. And we've got some Marines hanging around with guardsmen, a Contempt Dreadnought, I think taking on an Orc Dreadnought of some type. Then we had the Eldar Dreadnoughts, and the Orc Dreadnoughts, and some other bits and pieces to support you in the game. And then finally we had a colour illustration at the back. And all important here to illustrate that Rogue Trader Akale, 53rd Regiment of the Imperial Army, Rogue Trader Falway Tor, and Legiones Astartes Chapter 888, the Mentor Legion. See the Mentor Legion badge, that makes me think of the shoulder blocks on those. But as you can see, at this point, the Dreadnought was a tool for any Imperial force. It was not limited to the Astartes alone. That really did change. And I'll be really interested to see if one day we might see, I wonder if someone might resculpt one of these Dreadnoughts and reintroduce them into 40k. I had a chat with Will Hayes at an open day earlier this year, or maybe it was last year. No, I think it was earlier this year. And he actually really likes this design. And he was talking about how he could reintroduce it as a four-jaw model, I think. I don't know if he will, but I'll tell you, that would be absolutely awesome if he did. Anyway, so now let's go back to the miniatures and continue the journey. So there you go. That was the rules in the day. Quite different to what we have today, particularly the flexible angle of it. And artistically, they were very much woven into the look of the game from the outset. There weren't any more of these models produced in 28mm scale. It was just this original batch. So the Games Workshop certainly got a good mileage out of them. They did make an appearance, however, in the Adeptus Titanicus game and Space Marine, and eventually what became Epic, in a series of 6mm scale models of Contemptors, Deradios and Furibundus Dreadnoughts. This model did have that other imaging, but apart from that, that was all. I suppose these saw the game well, and they remained in use until 2nd edition came along in 1993, if I remember rightly, and a new Dreadnought appeared, and the Dreadnought ceased to be an Imperial piece of war gear, so you could have had them in Imperial Guard or squat armies, and now they became the exclusive province of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. And not only did the role in the game change, but the look was completely transformed. And that was realised in the form of this miniature, which was the Space Marine Dreadnought. And this was designed by 40k veteran and image guru Jez Goodwin. You couldn't imagine a more different design to the original sculpts by Bob Naismith. This is an enormous departure from that. And if we put the two alongside each other, apart from being bipedal war machines with close combat weapons and heavy weapons, there's no real similarity. And that change really sat alongside how these were now Space Marine only vehicles, and the lore developed around who went inside it. So it wasn't just any Space Marine, because of course Space Marines are incredibly valuable warriors. The concept became that Space Marines who had been maimed in battle and couldn't have their damage or wounds repaired, if a great enough warrior, they could be interred within the sarcophagus of a Dreadnought. And indeed, this thing is very much looking like a coffin on legs. So the look of this, as well as being, it's very classic Jez Goodwin with the angular sort of squareness to it, and it's a very distinctive way of depicting Imperial technology. I mean, it's a fantastic looking model, but symbolically, the visual appearance was very significant as well. It's like a living tomb of an ancient warrior, and that very much fed into how Space Marine lore was developing at the time, and continued to develop, with the Astartes becoming increasingly venerated and superhuman-like. This was originally cast in the original pewter, and this was an acquisition from a couple of other kits, and it's got original pewter feet. You may be able to tell with them being a slightly darker grey colour, but the rest of the kit is Games Workshop lead-free pewter, and that gave it an enormous weight. We'll come back to that, but let's just look at the miniature first. So the detail on this is very rich. A lot more parts than the previous model, a lot bigger. You had the feet, you had the legs, which is a single piece. You had 1, 2, 3, 4 components that made up the body, and the exhaust stack. You had 2 weapons, a claw or a manipulator, and the smoke dispenser on top. Yeah, very nicely done. It's got these sort of sensors and other devices here. All this cabling as if it's the control systems linking into the sarcophagus with the Marine inside. A vision slit. I wonder if he was influenced a bit by some of the designs from Robocop 2. It does put me in mind of that, a bit of some of the alternate Robocop designs. There's a thought for you. Big square shoulders. big, hefty close combat weapon with all this cabling, power lines and all sorts. A storm bolter mounted underneath. Looks great. I mean, I bored the barrels out on that, as I like to do. The big chunky power pack, very Jez Goodwin style, and puts you in mind of other things, perhaps like a Land Raider as well. It was another one of his designs. Very well detailed on the rim. I mean, the amount of detail on this was certainly impressive. In a different sort of way. I mean, this isn't to say the original ones weren't detailed. The original ones were just more smooth and curved and flat plates. This was lots of cables and angles and sharp corners, so very different feel and look. And then the multi-melter as well. Fortunately, it's had a bit of this darkening reaction. Yeah, another impressive sculpt and yeah, chunky, impressive looking weapon. I did some drilling on this, so drilled out the barrels of the multi-melter, and likewise the smoke dispenser, which is a great design, and it's got like this little magazine of smoke grenades. I love that. Cool. Still one of my favourite parts of this Dreadnought compared to later ones. I also bored out the top of the exhaust stack as well. So this, as I say, this one is mainly made from lead-free pewter, and this weighs 222 grams. For those of you on metric, that's nearly 1/4 of a kilo. If you're in the Imperial verse, that's 1/2 pound almost. So these were heavy. When they were cast in the original leaded pewter, they were, it was ridiculously heavy, and they got a bit of a reputation for being hard to stick together because they were prone to breaking. And if dropped, well, they would either explode into a shower of parts. You would end up with a massive great dent across your sarcophagus, or a bent, knackered weapon, or a mixture of both. I suspect that some people may have had to go to hospital if they ever dropped one of these on their foot, because you could certainly break a toe. This particular miniature is what was called the Furioso Dreadnought, which was a variant for the Blood Angels. Now, I'm an Iron Hands player, and I don't like frilliness or excessive frilliness on Imperial vehicles, so I actually removed the eagle design and the rest of it from the sarcophagus, ready for something a bit more subdued. Purity seals from this arm, eagle from here, eagle from here. I've tried to make this look like a more neutral Dreadnought. It gives you kind of like a bit of a better feel for what the design looked like, although it does remove the iconography of the Dreadnought. I just forget if this was the first one or if it was a version which was like the standard Marine version with the assault cannon, which they sold in a packet painted up in ultramarine colours. There are a whole variety of metal Dreadnoughts that came along in this design. There was this one, the original one. There was the, I don't know what they called it, Hellfire Dreadnought or something, which had a las cannon and a missile launcher, or a twin las cannon and a missile launcher, or twin linked las cannon at the time. Then there was more. There was a Blood Angels close combat variant, which was like this, but with a pair of fists. There was then a Dark Angel variant with some Dark Angel iconography. There was a standard Space Wolf variant, which had some tassels and furs on it. And then there was a Space Wolf character Dreadnought as well, which was Bjorn the Fell-Handed. So that furred the Dreadnought up to max. Petter would have loved it if they'd been around back then. So there were quite a variety of models produced on this basic sculpt. As I say, it was very heavy, which wasn't ideal. If you weren't a lot of people who bought these were kind of like teenagers. They didn't have a lot of experience, so they weren't the easiest kits to build always. The ones cast in lead-free pewter were an absolute nuisance to clean up if you're looking for a professional standard finish. This took several evenings' work to get to this state and get rid of all the mould lines. There were some pretty noticeable mould lines. Hours and hours and hours of filing, because GW pewter is absolutely rock solid. It's my least favourite medium to work with. And it was probably that and other cost reasons that takes us to the next step in our story, which was the appearance of a plastic Space Marine Dreadnought kit. And here we have a nice one here. So for the first time we had a Dreadnought that wasn't metal. So for the first time we had a multi-part plastic kit and not a metal Dreadnought. This made construction and just general living with use a lot easier, and also introduced some really handy options for weapon modularity. In terms of the detail, I don't think anything was really lost in terms of the actual detail on this. Clearly, The lines aren't as sharp as on the metal model. You just can't get that with plastic. But it was a good kit. And much, much easier to convert. I mean, if you're even so inclined, you could start messing around with the legs and have a realistic chance of putting some motion into those. This particular version at the moment, I mean, this has got a Dreadnought close combat weapon, a flamer, same sort of design around the back as before. Smoke dispenser, not as nice smoke dispenser, I mean, that's still the best one. So I imagine many people's armies featured these things. Now, this particular kit, which I think is, I'm not sure when this dated from, but this is a current one they sell, was great because as well as your classic assault cannon close combat combo, you got a twin las cannon, twin link las cannon, and a missile launcher you could also mount on this. So straight away, this was a great kit because you got more with it. And the fact it was plastic meant they could give you these options at a much cheaper cost, whereas, you know, it's basically the same cost as, you know, doing this with or without those. There's not much cost difference in it. Whereas adding extra weapons into a kit for this is a lot of extra cost because you have to cast it and the material's expensive. So this Dreadnought kind of set the bar for a long time. After this came out, which I believe it originally came out in 97, I think this particular version is a reissue that came out a number of years later. Space Marine Dreadnought Design didn't go anywhere for a long time after that. And these two were pretty much it, or this guy. This was produced in many variants. There are a whole host of chapter specific takes on this. We then also had the Ironclad Dreadnought, which was a different kit again. So yeah, a very versatile model, but in terms of the actual basic design, well, it's pretty much as it was. It kind of filled a medium armor role in the Space Marine army, but never was going to go anywhere beyond that. So that's kind of like Space Marine Dreadnoughts for much of the history of them. I suppose one thing we've not done is just looked at the size. So here we've got our classic LE2 Imperial Space Marine from 1985. So when first released, these Dreadnoughts were really big. They were actually about twice Marine height. Certainly the long-legged version. Stubby legs, a bit less so. And these were not really that much taller. I mean, obviously this is on a scenic base, so its height is slightly elevated. It weren't really that much taller, but the bulk was just massively increased compared to these guys. So yes, that was pretty much it as far as Space Marine Dreadnought models went from a core design viewpoint. The only advances on these were what Forge World did, and they took this design, the Castroferrum design as it became known, and they produced a whole variety of chapter-specific variants, lots of weapon options, and even some more character dreadnoughts, which were quite cool. Like much of the Space Marine force, it was a pretty static range of miniatures for a long time, certainly throughout the 90s and the noughties. And you might have thought that Space Marine Dreadnoughts weren't going anywhere. And, well, I guess they weren't. Until, of course, 2011. In 2011, Forge World came on the scene with an original design. And this is the now ubiquitous and, let's say, very highly regarded model of the Contempt Dreadnought. This broke new ground for Dreadnought design for Games Workshop. It gave us for the first time a fully posable and articulated Dreadnought model. The posability of these things was absolutely stunning, and I can remember at the time whole hosts of entries into Golden Demon competitions and the like, which put these in amazing dynamic poses and fully exploited the posability of the kit. The designer of this is Will Hayes, who is one of Forge World's sculptors. He really tapped into something with this version. This particular model I've got here is armed with a pair of assault cannons, or, well, Kerry's assault cannons. It's got a missile launcher mounted on top, and it's got this optic. So this was actually the Mortis variant. But you could get it in standard variants as well. Design-wise, this shook things up somewhat and harked back to the earlier Naismith designs in terms of its curved, rounded profile, as opposed to the Goodwin Boxnaut or the Castroferrum. However, though, there were still some nice pickup on cues with the power pack was clearly a direct inspiration from the Jez Goodwin Dreadnought. The actual origin of this design is something else though, and it actually comes from a rather obscure miniature from the days of the Space Marine 6mm game, or Adeptus Titanicus, what eventually became Epic. And there was a set released, and I think it was called the Space Marine Battle Force, and in it you got some dreadnoughts, and they were unlike anything that came before them. And if we just exploit the great posability of the Contemptor, it was armed something like that, with a close combat weapon and an assault cannon. And I don't know what the actual name of that dreadnought was, or even I can't remember who designed it, but it looked very much like this. And Will Hayes did a splendid job of going back to this tiny little figure and using it as the inspiration for the modern day Contempt. And this Contemptor was the beginning of what you might call the modern design explosion of dreadnoughts. I imagine this was a hugely successful kit for Forge World. I don't know if it's their most successful kit ever. Probably, it wouldn't surprise me if it is in terms of numbers sold, but it completely blew everything that had come before it in terms of the modelling opportunities it presented, and it looks great. And certainly for me, I love these from the outset. I was never really, in all fairness, that keen on the Castroferrum Dreadnought, and perhaps that's my personal bias because I started out with these guys. Then when these things appeared, it was a very jarring change in look, and for me these always looked really ungainly, whereas this thing looked like it could move quick if it wanted to. I have to admit, going back and building this one, I do actually appreciate this design a bit more now. I'm quite fond of this one now. I may actually get a couple just for giggles of the metal ones, because I like the weight of them. They are good models, and I love the magazine-fed smoke dispenser. So the release of Contemptor was the beginning of a period of, in the worlds of dreadnoughts, intense new development. And it was a Horus Heresy game that really drove the dreadnought design forward. Warhammer 40,000 was at this stage at a point where it had boxed itself into a creative corner with regards to creating new technology for the Imperium. The Horus Heresy removed that in-universe restriction on what could be new, and the people at Forge World exploited it to the full. And the next new design that came along was this impressive beast, and this is a Duradio Fire Support Dreadnought. And once again, Mr. Hayes, Will Hayes, went back to early 40k to draw inspiration for this model. Now, the actual where this came from is perhaps a little bit trickier to pin down. It looks very unlike other Space Marine Dreadnoughts. I mean, it has some similarities to the Contemptor, you can see in the general design. But it was also very different as well. And it was a great model, much more militaristic looking, or modern militaristic you might say, looking than other 40k models. You know, it looks like a ranged combat unit, pure and simple, and things like the the radar dome as well, and the missiles. Yeah, very much of that way. Now, as to where this came from, I mean, the Dreadnought name, well, clearly it was a re-imaging of this guy, the Duradio, but the actual look of the Dreadnought is hard to place. One possibility, and I'm not sure if this is true, is this is a re-imaging of the Chaos Dreadnought that came with the Space Crusade game from the early 90s, which, if I remember rightly, was a collaboration between Games Workshop and I think it was MB Games. It was done in the same sort of vein as Space Hulk. It was a futuristic version of Space Hulk. In that game, there was a Chaos Marine Dreadnought which had lots of weapons mounted on it, a bit like this, and it was very shooty. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that style that's been captured in this. Not sure, but yeah. Another fantastic addition to the Dreadnought lineup. Now, at this point, one might have thought the next Dreadnought that will appear is going to be a re-imaged version of the Furibundus. The Contemptor, the Duradio, and then the Furibundus. Well, not sure, because the next Dreadnought that came along was this beast, which of course was the Leviathan Siege Dreadnought of the Space Marine Legions. And once again, Will Hayes created another Forge World classic for the Horus Heresy game. And this thing, thematically, very much looks like an up-armoured cross between a Duradio and a Contemptor. An absolute beast of a machine. And this is a huge Dreadnought, this is. I mean, certainly stats-wise, this thing has a lot of similarities to the old Furibundus Dreadnought. Extremely heavily armoured, and it's very tough, like a Furibundus. However, it's not a long-range fire support unit. It's a short to assault dreadnought, so it's very close-range work. I'm not sure. Yeah, look at the size differential now between the two, the original and the new one. Absolutely colossal. Even if we take the Castroferrum Dreadnought and place it next to Leviathan, the Leviathan dwarfs it. So is the Leviathan Dreadnought a Fury Dreadnought, the old Rogue Trader Dreadnought in everything but name? I'm not sure. We'll have to, perhaps someone in the comments might know that. Forge will move Dreadnought Evolution on again in the context of Horus Heresy. The explosive period of new Dreadnought releases continued. A completely new force was introduced to Imperial Dreadnoughts. Now this is significant because here we have the Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought. This is one of two Custodian Guard or Legio Custodes Dreadnoughts that was produced by Forgeworld. This was very nicely painted for the channel by Broken Minis. Do check out his channel, he's got some nice painting videos. The other one was Contemptor Galatus, and these took the Contemptor Dreadnought and put it into the force of the Custodians. Now, size-wise, interestingly, these were kept scaled at the same size as the Astartes. Now, this Contemptor is stood on a big pile of rubble, but they are actually of the same sort of height. I thought it was interesting that they decided not to expand the size of these any further. And very much this took the look of the Contemptor Dreadnought and added the filigree fantastic of the Custodians into it. And also created quite a stylized design. I mean, this looks like a knight wearing a suit of Renaissance armor, but additionally gave it a more high sci-fi look as well. So a fascinating blend of imagery. As I say, this is one of the two designs. The other was Galatus, which was equipped with a sword and shield. At that point you might think, well, the Dreadnought story was complete, but no, this period of enormous expansion and explosion of designs continued, and this year we got what is arguably the largest Dreadnought ever for the Imperium, which was this thing, and this is the Legio Custodes Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. And now the Dreadnought was starting to become monstrously large, and indeed in terms of in-game use, we're starting to push the boundary of what is a Dreadnought and what is a Super Heavy. That's what these things are like. But amazing look to this, absolutely cool model. Fantastic blend of ornate styling and filigree with high-tech science fiction styling as well. Brilliant. But even after all this time, we are essentially still sticking with the same format of close combat weapon with fist and a heavy weapon and any mixture thereof, and a supporting secondary weapon mounted on the top of the torso. So the Telemon Dreadnought, what I consider to be the largest Dreadnought thus far. There was one final page turn in the Space Marine Dreadnought evolution story, and that happened in concert with the release of 8th edition Warhammer 40,000 and the appearance of the Primaris Marines. And the Primaris Marines got their very own Dreadnought, and that is this guy, which is the Redemptor. And for the first time in 20 years, Games Workshop itself, as opposed to Forgeworld, created a brand new Dreadnought design from the ground up, and this is what we got. Instantly recognisable as something related to a Castroferrum Dreadnought, but much, much bigger, and this thing is absolutely huge. A new generation of weapons, but again, sticking with the formula, close combat weapon, secondary weapon, supporting weapon up on the top of the carapace, and then a heavy weapon as well. This also borrowed from the Leviathan Dreadnought with its chest-mounted weapons as well. And also, just to make sure we don't forget, but this is faithful to the concept of the Castroferrum. And once again, we know that this is the walking, fighting tomb of a Space Marine hero who's been interned within it. For me, I mean, this is a great looking model. It's much, much larger. I mean, let's just do the size comparison with the Castroferrum. It's huge. Even compared to the Telemon, it looks big, although I still argue, I mean, the Telemon is taller, certainly more graceful looking machine. It's a big beast, very bulky, and probably a bit more in line with the Leviathan. So here we are now with the Dreadnought design, 30 years on. It's perhaps unsurprisingly the artistic inspiration from this once again came from Jez Goodwin, and the obvious similarity to the preceding Castroferrum design can be seen, although the actual sculptor this time, digital sculptor, was Tom Walton. So another person has now got involved in the story of Space Marine Dreadnought imagery. It'd be interesting to see if we see more Dreadnoughts appear, or if, as happened before, we're going to get variations on the weaponry for this one. We will see. It's going to be interesting to see what happens given the enormous growth in Dreadnought designs available in the last few years. And I suppose we should probably finish up this episode of Retrohammer by going all the way back to 1987 and putting that alongside 2017. And if we take our original Rogue Trader Bob Naismith Dreadnoughts and place them alongside the Redemptor Dreadnought, completely unrecognisable in design influences, but nonetheless fundamentally the same unit. An occupant has been surgically implanted into the machine, and that machine has now become their body, and it is armed and equipped to fight as a walking tank, to take enemies on at range, and also equally well at close range in close combat. So the classic Dreadnought design remains unchanged. I hope you've really enjoyed this journey through time and look at Space Marine Dreadnought designs. It has been quite a big journey. I think we'll just bob those back there. And I hope that you're continuing to enjoy the Retrohammer series. And the Retrohammer series is supported by my Patreons. And if you would also like to support me in Retrohammer to acquire some of these old, rare and unusual models, please do go over and check out my Patreon page. You can support me from as little as $1 a month. So please do check me out. I'll be really grateful if you do that. So thanks very much, guys and girls. And I would like to personally thank all my Patreons for supporting me making this episode. People like Red Panda 7, Laurent Jaloux, Diego Flores, Kael, Alexander Korn, Zerius, Patriots, John Richardson, Nutspenny, Robert Allen Fairburn IV, Stuart Watley, Harris Richards, and Mikey Royce. Thank you all very much. That was Retrohammer. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.